Welcome to AEye Insights, where we talk about industry trends with proven business leaders. Our guest today is Reilly Brennan, general partner at Trucks Venture Capital and author of the popular newsletter, The Future of Transportation. Reilly, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jordan. It's great to talk to you. Usually our conversations are texts in the middle of the night about something big that's going on. So to put it all on Zoom here feels a little funny, but I'm happy to be here with you.
This is true. It's usually very candid, off the cusp discussions. So I'm excited to riff about where the transportation market's headed. And I think that, you'll have some really interesting insights given the very holistic approach to the market that you take in the newsletter that you put out. So, I think the obvious way to start, and one of the most common subjects that's discussed is what is the impact of COVID on all of these different areas of the market or segments of the market? How do you think it's going to play out with autonomous, ADAS, and all the supporting functions in the automotive value chain?
Sure. Well, first of all, I will say thank you to the AEye team for having me on. Before I get into your question, AEye was one of the first investments we made at Trucks Venture Capital back in 2016, I believe. It was really right when our fund was getting off the ground. So it's been great to be a partner of AEye for now over 4 years. My background coming to this discussion is, we run a small venture capital fund focused on transportation that's very early stage. So, usually we're giving the first check to a company as they're getting off the ground. And it's interesting because COVID has accelerated, obviously, a lot of things that people think about, like software and things related to delivery, while also probably tamping down on some of the expectations for, things that shared an asset, like, shared scooters and things like that, which had in the beginning a more difficult time. I think the big change with COVID, though, is all the behavioral changes that are probably going to be closer to permanent. There's that old saying that it takes 28 days to form a habit. And, we're well past the 28-day point with COVID. So all those things that people have been doing around delivery, particularly, I'm really fascinated about how those stick after a vaccine. And I think if you look at the way that most of those services work, for example, we have a Shipt subscription, which you buy for 12 months, or Instacart would be the same way. So even if the vaccine gets delivered and everybody is, quote unquote, cured tomorrow, there's going to be a lot of people who have already paid in advance for a lot of this stuff. And I think a lot of those behavioral changes will remain. And that's going to be interesting to watch over the next, few months, year.
Sure, and it's interesting because it's on the consumer buying side of things that I would see that those behavioral changes will have impacted people. And I'm curious about what that means, though, from the technology side. When you start looking up the or down the value chain, or up the value chain, however you want to look at it, from there, the question is, what are the implications that has on what people start to invest in to make those more streamlined logistics and everything else?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess one of the maybe big opportunities is, are we going to continue to operate in this universe where Amazon becomes the primary mechanism to get, in North America, at least, in particular the US, to get any good that you need? A lot of people now think Amazon first. And Amazon, of course, is building out a really interesting logistics network, potentially with vehicles, with their Zoox acquisition, potentially more with commercial vehicles down the road. I think maybe the bigger question is, are there other ecosystems out there that are gonna drive as much enthusiasm, and where you think of them first? And in that regard, to your question, I think about, Shopify and other platforms that are, out there in the ether, that are knitting together a lot of parts of e-commerce. And ultimately, although it sounds kind of insane right now, would eventually Shopify have a logistics network? Would Shopify have need for vehicles, for trucking, for commercial delivery? I think you could probably imagine that it's not too far away for a Walmart in the United States, or potentially a Loblaw in Canada, or Costco, or any of these other big retail entities to support systems like that. And so I think about first the software that knits together the commerce, and ultimately getting that to your door. And so those are some of the things I'm thinking about with your question.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I would assume that there's multiple levels of vertical integration, I suppose, within that logistics model, because I've seen everything from the companies, and I'm sure you have as well, from the companies that do just the logistics side of things, and are trying to set up the ways, to track items from the ports through to the consumer, to the actual first mile, last mile delivery vehicles, and everything in between. So I'm very curious, though, what you see as the greatest opportunity there, because there are people like Amazon who arguably are going to want to control everything end to end, and they even have they started from the touch point of the consumer, and I'm curious of how that will impact people and how they want to fit into the value chain, or companies and how they want to fit into the value chain. What are your thoughts on that? And have you seen anything really cool?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of, I guess, macro trends to think about. One is, so much of commercial logistics is moving to short haul, things under 500 miles. So whereas historically you might move a bunch of goods from a big assembly facility or distribution center thousands of miles to get it to a local distribution center and ultimately put it in a retail store. Now there's like so many more moves around a retail location. A company might have multiple distribution centers, and that, just as the background of this discussion, is really fascinating from a real estate perspective, but also it means all the different points along the journey that different entities or different vehicles might move a good. And so you have, instead of one long, sort of like line haul trip to a DC, you have, break that up into many other different trips. And so the value of real estate, and the people who are holding these goods is really fascinating. There's a company I'm sure you've heard of called Prologis. I'm always kind of keen on following what Prologis is doing, because many times they're Amazon's landlord. They're the people who will actually go and break ground, put in a warehouse, and then invite customers like Amazon, et cetera, in to use their warehouse. And they've been putting those facilities in some really interesting places. And then think about all the systems that need to service the moves between those distribution centers. So, we have a portfolio company called Gatic, which does exactly that. They move middle mile trips between DCs. And then we did a investment in a Canadian company called Swift, which does things. They basically will allow a retailer to do same day delivery by having a courier go and pick up things directly from a warehouse. And so there's a ton of opportunity here, because if you look at the movement of how commerce is changing, coupled with consumer preferences and all these new trends around e-commerce and delivery, there's so much movement under the hood of getting a package to you that's actually way more interesting than robotaxi. I know that when people got into autonomous vehicles 4 or 5 years ago, the dream and the thought was always around people. But I think for many years, many people considered the commercial delivery part of AVs. I always considered it like, people thought of it as the Sancho Panza of autonomous vehicle investment. But then in 2020, everyone was like, oh, wait, that's actually going to be more important. So you've seen a rush of things into delivery and commercial goods, and that's not going to change.
Sure, and I'm curious though to hear your thoughts. So there's first I'll start with Gatic publicly has a big partnership that you could talk to that I believe is with Walmart.
Yep,
and they're
with
doing
Walmart.
and they are doing some of the logistics side of that. But I know that a big part of their effort, it also starts to dovetail into the automation of the vehicles themselves as well, and
Mm-hmm.
actually how to create these logistics systems that are automated. And there's, we've seen, and I'm sure you have too, an interesting transition. And my prediction was, or our prediction was at AEye, that there was going to be an emergence of all of these distilled down, or let's say more constrained versions of autonomy that are more limited in function rather than the just, everywhere all the time automated vehicles that we were promised, or people are pursuing still somewhat. But there's derivatives of it. I mean, there's long haul trucking, there's middle mile, there's first and last mile, there's all these different ways. And they're, usually it's about a technology reduction in scope. It's like, if you're automating a truck from hub to hub, it's a lot easier of a problem than trying to automate something that goes anywhere all the time. And similarly, these applications start to fall out, so or start to, I guess, work themselves out, because there's business opportunities that exist with considerable demand, and with a much more downscope technology problem. What are some of the applications that you're seeing in that regard that have piqued your interest? What are some of the trends you've seen in those areas? Because Gatik and Swift are obviously examples of that, but I'm sure you have similar predictions in the space.
Yeah, we came up with this term, I think it was in 2016, of structured autonomy. And the thought was, look at all
really
these
like
huge vertical markets that, everybody's focused on robotaxi, but what about ag and mining and construction and trucking? And actually trucking is like the Taco Bell 7-layer burrito. There's all these different parts of it you could pull apart, and you could just have one company with amazing leadership and incredible value in only one part of that. So trucking is almost too broad of a term, but absolutely. I mean, we would like to have the number one best company in all those different structured autonomy environments. We have made a handful of investments across these. So I don't actually think that we have ever publicly disclosed this, but I'll say for the benefit of this discussion, we invested in a company called Telio earlier this year, which does automation in construction, and they use a lot of teleoperation. That's actually where a lot of the core IP is, but it's focused on this structured environment of construction. We've done in ag bear flag robotics, which is on farms, and they're doing some specific tasks there. I think one of the fascinating parts about structured autonomy is thinking about, is the vehicle movement the hardest part of this, or is it a bunch of other tasks that get integrated into the application? So what I mean by that is bear flag, which automates farm stuff. Moving a vehicle on a farm is actually really simple because there's no pedestrians, there's no cross traffic, there's no traffic lights, there's no rules of the road per se, because you're on private land. So getting the tractor run autonomously actually isn't that difficult. But what is difficult is knowing where and how to apply that vehicle within an environment. So do you want to move something behind the tractor? Do you want to pull a tool or some sort of application? Do you want to spray? Do you want to mow? Do you want to do something else? That's actually where the value is. So when you look at these applications of structured autonomy, it's always like the autonomy part plus this other thing. And together that actually creates the value. So in trucking or in delivery, for example, it's not just good enough to move from point A to B. It's also like integrating with the package itself, or letting somebody with the right authorized control open up the back of the vehicle. It's all those things. And I think that's actually the harder part. It's not just about the vehicle movement piece. Not to simplify that, because that's also quite difficult.
Sure. And I mean, even at not just the opening of the truck bed, but also the actual onloading and offloading of the containers, all the different components that go into that. I could see that being a big part of
Right.
that. But that obviously, and I have a biased interest here in moving the discussion to this, but I'm sure that lends itself to there's unique sensors that you're going to need for every different one of those applications. Because for automation, there's different types of sensors, and there's different types of sensors regarding not just the automation of the vehicle, but also all those other very key discrete components of how to access the I guess containers or the equipment or whatever, and actually create actionable information and to then carry out that action. And so
Sure.
I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on how that is evolving and what you see in the space, because you clearly follow it very closely, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of the recent announcements in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess engineers are putting together vehicles for these tasks. I think of them like chefs, because they're looking at a particular task and they're trying to figure out the right ingredients to go really achieve the goals of the system. So, we're making cookies here, and you could use different recipes. You can kind of approach a cookie from a different way, right? You could have a little bit more flour here, a little bit more baking powder there, a little bit more sugar, and depending on what you really are trying to do, the mix of that is quite different. And the same is really true of sensors, right? So there's no dogma that says must deploy this type of sensor if you're going to have autonomous vehicles or even ADAS vehicles. The better approach to that is to have a better matched sensor to an application. So you might not need the most powerful AI sensor capable if you're only doing ag applications. But on the other hand, if you're doing long haul trucking, you might want the full bore, the best that Louis and team can give us AI sensor, because that's what we're doing. And that's actually the really interesting part, I believe, of this next era of automation is you will have customers, and ultimately, in time, the stock market value some of these sensors and some of these things depending on what the most valuable applications are. So on-road applications at high speed, you clearly want to have incredible range at low light reflectivity, for which AI builds a great sensor. For these other things, you'll have this other set. And I've always been fascinated, and I think I've learned a lot of this from you guys, the incredible dogma around sensor types. And it's actually kind of it's like a bit of a folly to argue over what the right sensor is. It's better to know what the application is first and then work backward to the sensor.
Sure, and I think that in looking, I remember very clearly, when I was in my old venture capital role, I was looking at the value chain, and actually I was looking at a number of different applications for UAVs back when there was a whole craze about UAVs. And the interesting thing was, when you looked at the value chain, it was a similar concept, right? It was trying to create actionable data for these applications, whether it was a topography map that you were trying to create for agriculture, or whether it was a pipeline or wire or some type of power line monitoring, so that you're making sure there's no degradation of those wires or pipes. And accordingly, you're trying to create actionable information, and it became ironic, because there was never an evangelist argument about which sensor was the best sensor. It was which was the right sensor. But the right sensor comes with I guess a number of different associated variables that have to do with how it can be configured. And the ways in which you use it. And so there's implications of what you'd want to use a camera for, or a multispectral camera, or a thermal camera, or what you'd want to use a radar for. And ultimately, I like to say that at AEye, at least, we're not evangelists about the sensor type. If you say you wanted to remove radar or ultrasonics or camera from the car, I'd say you're removing one of your senses. As a human, why would you take away your sound and your hearing and your eyesight when you're trying to drive? It's a silly concept to try and promote one or the other. But then there's another aspect of it, which is the issue that I've seen a lot of, though, is that sometimes people choose the wrong sensor and try to out hardware the software, or out hardware with software, and try to work around it with software. And so it's finding the right fit. You're 100% right there. So what is interesting to you, though, about the market and the emergence, and I'm sure you've seen all the SPAC announcements, especially in the sensor space. What do you think about that market, and what is there to expect? Because there's a lot of people that are preaching their sensor or their discrete widget is the right one that'll solve all problems. What do you think there?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely springtime for AV and censor public companies, right? So I think obviously a lot of this has been pulled in from the EV side because of Tesla. And I was actually thinking earlier in the summer that the Tesla impact on the public markets would have a negative impact on anybody doing something in LiDAR who wanted to go public, because of course, all along we've heard that, Tesla's fearless leader doesn't like LiDAR. And so I thought, well, God, if all these other stocks are really impacted by what Tesla does, what will happen when the LiDAR companies come out? And in fact, that the opposite has happened, that the market is, I think, making a couple of different big storyline assumptions about where the vehicle business is headed. And in the macro, they're true. One is that electric vehicles are a dominant force, both because of consumer acceptance. We've seen a quarter more people want to shop an EV now as opposed to 24 months ago. And also policy-wise, right? So you have governments of significance who now say by 2030 or 2035, the only cars that we want to see sold are, EVs or EV hybrids. So there's this huge thing with EVs. That's a macro story that's absolutely true. The individual stocks and the individual companies are going to bring us there. I don't trade public equities as my day job, so thankfully I don't have to have an answer to that. On the sensor side, I also think the markets are accurate in saying so much of the value of these vehicles in the future is going to be on their intelligence. And so whether that's on the supercomputer side, like an NVIDIA, or a perception side, those are accurate claims. I mean, these are the same arguments that you would have found in a venture capitalist office making early stage investments in 2015 or 16, that now, 6-7 years later, the public markets are starting to trade on. So I think those are right on. Individual companies in this space, I would say it's going to be really interesting how their contracts play out. Like, how will we see the contract value of these companies as new vehicle production platforms get announced? And that's where ultimately how they will be judged. You don't walk in and buy a Innoviz at the auto parts store today. The way to judge these public companies, the ones that are coming out, is on the content value in the new platforms. And so really excited about that. Obviously, there's stuff we can't talk about regarding AI that's super exciting too. So just looking forward to all these announcements coming out.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, though, it will be, I will make a bold prediction that it's going to be the value of your ability to fit into the value chain and leverage that. Because to your point, you're not going to buy an Innoviz or an AI, you're going to buy a continental product within an overall larger OEM bundle. And so I think that's I agree with you that I think that there will be a need for a lot of different sensors, and we will see how they play out. But the flexibility and the ability to fit into the value chain are going to be key in growth and expansion to the broadest possible market, similar to what Mobileye demonstrated.
Yep.
So on that note, though, I unfortunately, very disappointingly, we have to have our conversation come to an end. We are out of time, but it is always great to talk with you. Reilly,
great talking with you, Jordan.
As you said earlier, you were an early investor, and we've always been very proud of our partnership with Trucks VC. And we're very excited and thankful to have you joining us, and we'll hopefully be able to do this again next year to see how our predictions and our discussions stacked up.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, AEye team.
Thank you very much, and thanks for joining AEye Insights.